Welcome to Team Futurism. Today I'm interviewing Ben Murnane. Ben is an author and journalist based in Dublin. He earned a PhD in English in 2016 from Trinity College. Ben is the author of a number of books, and his most recent book is a biography of the transhumanist Zoltan Istvan. It's called Transhuman Citizen. Ben, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Peter. It's a real pleasure.
Excellent. So, I mostly want to talk about the book that's coming out. It's actually going to come out in July, right? But you can pre-order it right now. Yes. I want to spend most of the time today talking about that, but I also want to get into a little bit of your backstory. So there's this quote at the very top of the book when you first open the new book. It's by Zoltan, and he says that you are, quote, an expert on futurist issues and libertarian philosophy, and where those two areas collide. Tell me a little bit about your backstory with both futurism and libertarianism, and I want to get your thoughts on how you think that those two issues collide.
Sure, yeah. No, it's a very interesting history, I think, between futurism and libertarianism, both relatively new and certainly very contemporary political movements. I suppose, got my start thinking about these issues when I did my PhD, which you mentioned, in Trinity College. That was 2012 to 2016. And I suppose the first thing to say is I'm not, a futurist necessarily. I'm not a science guy. I'm not a tech guy. I'm a humanities guy by training, at least. So I'm not an expert on the technology in the same way that Zoltan might be. I'm more interested in the philosophy, I suppose, and how we orient ourselves toward the future. And so my PhD was on an American author who is quite divisive, Ayn Rand. She has had, I think, for a fiction author, and this is what I was interested in, what do people do after they read books in the real world? Do you know what I mean? How does the book impact how they behave, what they might do? And I think Rand was the perfect case study for a fiction author who had an immense real world impact in politics, in Silicon Valley, on the arts. So Rand, just briefly came from the Soviet Union, immigrated to America, became a fierce opponent of communism and socialism, became a fierce advocate of capitalism and futurism, I would say, in her own way, because she was a proponent of technology and she was a proponent of capitalism as a creative sphere, which you don't often see. You don't often see that kind of articulated as a defense of capitalism. Her whole argument was that capitalism is creative, right? Because we start businesses, because we invent new things, because we're always creating in that environment. And it's the optimum economic, political environment for that kind of individual mind-driven creation. That was her view. So I think that had a big impact on entrepreneurs. And understandably, you can kind of see how someone who wants to start a business or wants to create a new invention reads The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged, which were Rand's two major works, and becomes inspired. So she tells, I suppose, interesting stories about creation and about capitalism through entertaining plots. The Fountainhead is the story of an architect who, I guess you could say Howard Rourke, the main character, he'll go to any lengths to realize his artistic vision, even going so far as to blow up a public housing project that he designed, and he blows it up because his designs are tinkered with by the authorities, and so it's kind of like an extreme defense of artistic integrity. And you can see how someone who had a very fierce vision of what they wanted to invent in the world would take a story like that and see it as inspirational. Same with Atlas Shrugged, which I guess expands on that extreme view of individualism, but puts it in a societal context where it becomes a defense of capitalism as the optimum system for individualists to achieve whatever is in their own mind, regardless of what society thinks. And so, yes, you can see how entrepreneurs would be inspired by that vision. And so Rand did inspire many entrepreneurs and many well-known entrepreneurs. It's quite well documented, I suppose, at this point. And it's something I wrote about in my book. Many folks who, started businesses in Silicon Valley, Steve Jobs, Jimmy Wales, lots of well-known names. Peter Thiel, very much influenced. And so I was interested in that. And also how...
Can I ask you, I'm just kind of question, not to jump in, but do you think, to play a little alternate history, do you think no Ayn Rand, no Silicon Valley? Or, I mean, how drastic was her actual influence, do you think? I mean, one thing that was fascinating about reading the biography of Zoltan is, I mean, it kind of seems like reading Ayn Rand kind of made him. Like, in a sense, it gave him that vision for what to do next. I think you can kind of say, maybe without talking to Zoltan, I'm not sure, you'd have to ask him, but like, it seems like reading the biography, no Ayn Rand, no Zoltan running for president in 2016, right? Like, it seems like that connection is that tight, but like real world implications wise, do you think that you could say something as dramatic as no Ayn Rand, no Silicon Valley, or do you think that that's going way over the top?
Well, that in itself might be over the top. I think that's something that's very hard to prove, right? But
what's the strongest statement you could make, do you think, about her?
I think I would bring it back to Rand's own individualist mindset, which is, I think you could certainly say of Zoltan what you just said, which is that if he hadn't read The Fountainhead, he, probably wouldn't have written the book that he did and run for president. And I think when you go to an individual level, you can maybe make those cases. Steve Wozniak was a big proponent, or has said several times, that Atlas Shrugged had a huge impact on Steve Jobs. And so I don't know that you can extrapolate from that to no Ayn Rand, no iPhone, but I think that's a conversation you can certainly have. That's what's interesting about the humanities, right? You can't always prove those causal connections, right? But it's an interesting conversation to have. And I think, why not make the case for fiction and kind of getting inspired by something that is crucial, right? That is crucial to invention. That is crucial to the things that end up in the world. And so
I'm so on board with this. Like, I mean, because I come from a literary background as well, right. And I write actually all the time about the power of stories. Right. And I mean, you really can tell, I think, the story of humanity through our stories. Just think about like the story of Jesus, the story of Abraham. These are like, I'm an atheist, so I don't take them as literal. So to me, they are kind of like just literature. And assuming that they are just literature, not like history, think about the power of those stories, right? I mean, they're so powerful. And I kind of think that if Nietzsche hadn't written in such beautiful, flowery language, no one would remember him. His ideas were cool, but they probably would have gone away. There's something so compelling about the way he writes. He draws you in, and it feels like reading fiction when you read like Zarathustra or whatever it is. You know what I mean? And so it's the same thing with Ayn Rand. Like, her ideas were compelling, but she seems kind of radical and kind of crazy and kind of wacky when you just like listen to her in interviews, right? She's like a little bit like just manic, and like she's enjoyable, but she's kind of crazy. But like when you read her works, I'm actually not too huge of a fan of her books, but beside the point. But when you read her books, they draw you in, and like you get to play the hero's journey thing, etc. So that's very cool. And I actually want to run an idea by you. Okay, so I've had this thought a lot when I was reading your biography of Zoltan, and maybe we'll pivot to talking more about Zoltan specifically here. But I had this thought kind of again and again and again, that he in a sense is not necessarily a political figure or kind of any of the things he's kind of known for. He's kind of a literary figure. And there are quotes of him in the book saying about like he just wanted to write the next Ayn Rand novel, the next most powerful novel. And he dedicated 4 years of his life to this. And it was such a big deal to him. And then also like the dude basically does nothing but write articles. I mean, like every day on Twitter, he's dropping another article that he's writing. He's a writer. He's almost, in a sense, you can look at him as a modern day Hunter S. Thompson, as much as a political candidate or whatever else he's up to. He's kind of a literary figure, right? I mean, like that's how I have come away a little bit looking at him, which I think is very cool because again, literary figures have like crazy power in society. What do you think about that idea?
I think that's very true. I think I refer to him in the book as a prophet of transhumanism or an evangelist, and I think that's what he is. He's an advocate, and a lot of advocates are writers, right? How does it start? You start by doing exactly what you said, which is telling stories, which is, describing the world in a way that you hope is persuasive to other people. So it's all wrapped up in one for me. He's a storyteller. He's a novelist, obviously. He's an activist. And Ayn Rand is certainly the model because she was a novelist. She was a philosopher. She was an advocate and an activist. She wasn't just, I suppose, writing books to entertain people. She wanted to, mold the world in her image to a certain extent. And that's absolutely what Zoltan wants to do. So I think all those comparisons are apt.
So one thing about Zoltan, and probably this relates very much to Ayn Rand, is he is a very controversial figure. And I learned this firsthand because I first met him in person at a Biohack the Planet conference in Oakland. And it was a lot of like Joe Zahner was there and a lot of people in the biohacking community. There were some like people from the New York Times there. It had a lot of like big names. And everyone, the audience was very in support of this cause. A lot of crazy like biohackers there. When Zoltan got up to speak, there were like boos in the crowd, and like the girl sitting next to me kept being like, "Oh, I can't believe this guy's speaking." She would like say things like out loud, talking to herself like that. She was so frustrated that this guy was there, and I was there like to see specifically Zoltan because I had just kind of like been turned on to the transhumanist thing, partly because of him, and I was just like after the conference, like I was speaking to him for a second, and I was just kind of like, I feel like everyone likes her message except for when you bring in the libertarian thing. And I was kind of curious, like, what if, maybe for certain audiences, what if you just, because if you're in like hyper lefty Oakland, the libertarian thing just does not read well. Even if you can spell out how it's a good thing for the world, it just does not read well. It has like a knee-jerk reaction from people in the Bay Area of like Ayn Rand is bad, right? But yeah, he leans into that controversy. He leans into it. And when you were talking to him, so you spent a lot of time with him writing this book, it sounds like, what is your sense of his, how controversial of a figure he is? Does he realize that? And in your view, does he play off of that? Yeah, give me your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. He plays off of it, and certainly he realizes it. I mean, again, he's full of contradictions, I would say, in a way. Like, he is a very, very pleasant man. He's a lovely person to spend time with. He's a very, I would say, kind person. He's a family man, obviously, wife and kids. So he has this whole life, and he has this amazing, I suppose, set of life experiences, which is what I wrote about in the book. His ideas, however controversial they might be, they don't come from him just reading a book and deciding this is the wackiest thing, and so I want to put it out there. He's had this whole life where he sailed around the world for 7 years in his 20s and visited over 100 countries. He started his career as a journalist working for National Geographic, and he worked in many war zones, and he was in Kashmir, and he saw, I suppose, man's inhumanity to man, and he came home and, he started a business. So he has had these kind of multiple lives and careers and is a real Renaissance man. So the way he's kind of settled on his libertarian politics is sort of interesting. The sailboat, I guess, was a big touchstone for him. And so he, when he set off at 21 years of age and he put together this boat, he bought it, but he outfitted it, I suppose, in the way that he wanted. And he brought 500 books with him. That idea of being alone by yourself on the ocean and responsible for your own destiny, I think that played a huge part in his turn toward libertarian politics. Obviously, Ayn Rand did. And just to finish that thought on Rand and libertarianism and futurism, her futurism comes from her advocacy of technology. Her libertarianism, small L libertarianism comes from her advocacy of the individual, obviously. And so Zoltan was certainly one of those people, someone who was inspired when he read Ayn Rand to kind of think of individualism and the individual mind and advancing yourself in the world, regardless of what society thinks and regardless of what the social pressures may be. Like, that's the kind of libertarianism that is Zoltan's origin story, if you like. How that manifests in terms of politics, and once you get into party politics and policy trade-offs and so on, that's when it becomes very fraught and complex, and when people maybe judge you one way or the other depending on the current political moment.
Yeah, honestly, like I kind of recommend anyone buy the book just for the latter part of the book where it talks about Zoltan kind of figuring out what policies to run with. As he ran, well, I mean, this itself is kind of interesting. He ran for president 2016 as a transhumanist, the party he started, and then he ran for governor of California, and then he ran for president again in 2020 as a Republican. And all of that is really fascinating, and just like his ability to make that make sense. I know some people would kind of like pivot around like that, and it would be like, what you doing? Like, this makes no sense or whatever. But for him, it actually does totally make sense, and he articulates it in a way that it's almost worth the full price of the book just to see how he managed all of that. I think that was very fascinating and insightful. But yeah, I mean, do you think that? I mean, like, what resonates about his policies and his vision with so many people? Would you say, is it the transhumanism? Is it the individualism? Because he amassed like a very large following. And how did you see all that all kind of come together? And I mean, how powerful and how large is that movement right now, do you think? And how lasting?
Sure. So, yeah, very interesting questions. I think Zoltan's following is large and growing. I mean, it's not massive. You're talking maybe tens of thousands in terms of his social media following, and his number of voters certainly is small in each of those elections that you mentioned. But the attention that he's got is much wider, and that's why he consciously has chosen to be controversial. He definitely took the view that the way to get media attention as a third-party candidate, in the first instance, or as a relative political unknown when he ran in the other couple of elections, the way to get attention is by creating controversy, right? Is by making controversial statements, is by doing crazy things like driving around in a coffin-shaped bus and handing out atheist pamphlets in a mega church, doing these things that are going to be controversial, nailing his 95 Theses, his transhumanist Bill of Rights onto the Capitol building, doing these controversial things to get media attention, deliberately. And so that's why he's a polarizing figure as well, even within the transhumanist movement, because he has consciously sought out attention. He is not afraid of controversy. He deliberately creates controversy. And I think for people in the transhumanist movement, who've maybe been longer established in the movement and have a more philosophical view of what it should stand for, he gives transhumanism a bad name. He's more interested in media headlines maybe than actually changing someone's mind, right? That's the view. So there certainly was a view around when he ran for president in 2016. Originally, there was a petition started among transhumanists to basically disavow him as somebody who was running in the name of transhumanism, basically saying, that he, gives transhumanism a bad name. If this is what people think about transhumanism, we're not going to change anybody's mind. We're not going to do anything. So I think those are two legitimate ways to look at it. On the one hand, is it worth getting your message out if people hear the wrong message, right? On the other hand, Zoltan's idea is just to beam the word transhumanism into as many households as possible. And hopefully, people start Googling and people maybe find out more about the movement that way. So I think there are two different approaches. That's why he's been controversial. I think in terms of his political appeal, it's definitely futurism. It's a futurist vision. It's growing, but it's still very small. I think when you look at our society today, and maybe you feel this way as well, given the nature of your work, that we live in a negative society, a society that's very negative philosophically towards innovation and progress, I would say, and that looks maybe at what humans can achieve in the wrong way, that we're destroying ourselves and that we're not creating a good future for our children, versus an expansionist viewpoint where I would like to see us living on other planets and maybe doing the transhumanist thing of moving beyond humanism and replacing our limbs and becoming stronger. I grew up with a very rare illness, which limited my life and gave me a low life expectancy when I was younger. And I only survived through medicine and modern technology. And there are very few people advocating for the lengths to which technology can take us within the political sphere. Obviously, Silicon Valley is a thing and big tech is a thing, but outside of the companies themselves, there aren't many people, I would say, presenting a positive vision of where tech can take us. It's more likely to be, how do we mitigate the harms of AI? How do we, protect our kids from social media? And so I think philosophically, it's not that we need to ignore the risks at all, but we need to acknowledge maybe that new technologies are a good thing and can take us further, and that we want the human race to expand and grow. And so Zoltan is a figure who really advocates for those things, even if at the extreme end, he's an extreme advocate of where technology could take us. And I think that definitely has an appeal, because there isn't a voice for that within the traditional party system, I would say, in the States, maybe anywhere in the world. And so I think that's his route to growing more. But he's been trying to do it in multiple ways. He's done it obviously as an independent or as the candidate of his own party. He's tried to bring the message to the traditional parties. He run for the Republican nomination. He was an endorsed candidate for California governor as a libertarian. So he's tried it multiple ways and not maybe seen a huge amount of traction apart from the media attention. So I know he's always thinking, what's the next thing I can try? Maybe it's the Democrats next. Maybe it's maybe it's running for election outside the States. But he's a very practical political thinker. That's actually what one of his campaign managers, Pratik Chugul, said to me in an interview for the book. And you could, again, look at it two ways. He's very flexible, Zoltan. If he sees that certain policies aren't, he'll create controversy to get the media and get the attention. But if he sees that certain things aren't going to be popular, he'll drop them like a hot potato, and he'll adapt his policies, because his main goal is to kind of enable people to live much longer lives. And I know he personally wants to live forever, whether that's possible or not. That's maybe another conversation, but he believes that through modern technologies and genetic engineering and mind uploading and these new things which may become possible, that he could potentially live forever. And I know he wants that personally, and he wants that to be an option for all of us. And politically, that's his number one goal. So he doesn't mind whether that happens through massive state intervention or through companies producing the technologies. And so he's prepared to be adaptable depending on what constituency is most receptive to his message. And that's why he's interesting, because yes, people feel he's one way or the other, and they maybe have negative views to his libertarianism, but he's actually quite adaptable. If you don't like these policies, he has others.
This is one thing I really liked about Zoltan is that, I mean, for example, Aubrey de Grey has said that, or he's kind of broken life extension down into a series of problems, all of which can be solved with a big money figure at the top. Like, this will cost this much money to solve, and then there's like 9 of them or whatever, right? And each of them has like 5 billion here, 2 billion here, and we can just solve these problems. And he's done that thoughtfully, and he's thought that out. And you almost have to, at some level, take that seriously, in that what if there's even a 5% chance that that's true, that we can solve aging and all diseases with, let's just say, $10 billion or whatever. In the grand scheme of things, that's not much money. Yeah. And you need someone just yelling from the hilltops, hey, this is possible, guys. Even if it's not like possible, maybe it again is like 5% possible. Like
Right.
the benefit that could bring is so massive and just life-changing. We're a different species at that point. The second someone does, and that is a political project, and it's someone who can just like be a rock star about it and again, like shout it from the hilltops. And that's what Zoltan's doing. And fundamentally, I think that is kind of his project, is to just like be the guy. Like he's not Aubrey de Grey, like he's not a, doesn't have a biology degree or whatever, so he can't like be doing hard science. But like we have people doing hard science. They're there. Like Aubrey de Grey and his team, they're there. They just need someone to give them money. And you get them money by having like the weirdo on the hilltop shouting about this whole thing and what's possible. So yeah, I think that's very cool. So when you're talking to Zoltan, and I've talked to him a couple times, I've interviewed him a couple times, and I've gotten the sense that he's very like genuine about this. But yeah, what's your sense about how much he believes in these causes? Do you think he actually believes he could live forever, or that humanity could solve these problems?
I think he needs to believe, and this is maybe the more interesting question. I think he wants it to be a part of his life so much that he really believes it's possible, but he also needs to believe it because his entire political life, his entire view of the world, his entire hopes for his own future are based on this idea that he might get to live forever, right? Mm-hmm. And so genuinely, I think he does think it's possible through the science. The problem with that is, 15 years ago, it was going to be in 15 years. It always gets pushed out, but that doesn't mean it's not ultimately possible, right? It's just maybe a more difficult problem, or it isn't something that can be solved immediately. But so Zoltan is an evangelist who, 15 years ago was going to be 15 years. Today, it's maybe the next 50 years. But he fundamentally does believe that something like living forever will be possible. But psychologically, for me as his biographer, what was interesting is, why he wants to believe that and why he doesn't want to accept death. That's a whole other conversation. But yes, I do think he believes it.
What's so weird about that and almost like chilling is that, yes, they're having people who have been saying like, 15 years out, and then still 15 years pass, and et cetera. Who's been kind of like weirdly, scarily right about this is Ray Kurzweil. His timeline has been pretty accurate, as maybe the only person that I know about who's been kind of accurate about it. Because he says, progress is not linear, it's exponential, and here's what's going to happen next. And he's been kind of right about everything. And he says it's 2045 that we're going to get AGI, and then we're going to solve all of these problems because we're going to be living with God effectively. We will have created God effectively at that point. Yeah, I mean, what's your thought about that?
Well, I think, it's such an
Or how optimistic are you? Maybe let's say, are you optimistic about this?
I am optimistic. I think it is such an interesting industry, or such an interesting philosophy, transhumanism, because, I guess it's like anything, but even more so, it's not possible until it's happened, and then it's de rigueur or whatever. I mean, AI is like that. We were all told about what AI could possibly do, and everybody's like, yeah, writers will be out of jobs, whatever, and then it happens, and all of a sudden there's this whole other conversation that has to happen. Cryonics is sort of like that. That's a whole other area of wacky science, but freezing your head, freezing your body. And I talked to Zoltan about this. It's an aspect of transhumanism, obviously, and one route that people see to maybe live longer or come back or have a whole second life. And Zoltan put it very well when he said cryonics will only catch on once they bring someone back to life.
Yeah, I agree.
It's crazy science until it's something that's possible, right? And yeah, I think Ray Kurzweil's timeline sounds good to me. I was on a panel in 2019 in Barcelona at an event there, and a view was put forward that the person who will live forever, the first person who will not die ever, has already been born. And I think that's interesting. It's not so much will we get the opportunity, it's somebody will get the opportunity probably within our lifetimes. And so Yeah, I think we have to be optimistic. I think there are certainly other conversations that happen in terms of what that means for humanity. But I'm all in favor of more options for more people all the time. And yeah, I'm optimistic.
So I'm really familiar with the landscape in California, America, about people's feelings about this. Freaks some people out, but a lot of people are generally, especially in Silicon Valley, people are like, "Oh yeah, let's try it." You know what I mean? That's what we're here to do. We're here to see what we can do and what we can accomplish. And I personally have this mentality of we've been there, done that with like basically everything. Humans are kind of hardwired to be kind of miserable and to like always explore and to seek. And so there was no like, I mean, everyone says the 90s were perfect, right? The 90s were great, but they weren't. People still were depressed and miserable and sad, and we still had junk food that we overindulge in, et cetera. But in any case, there's kind of like a, little bit of a mix. But in general, people in America are pretty, I think if you really drill them to the wall, they're like, yeah, for sure, I'll be optimistic about this. What's the sentiment in Europe? I know that Europeans do have a different mindset about a lot of these things just because every single news story I hear about technology in Europe, it's only about regulation. Maybe that's just because I'm sitting here in California and that's just what trickles down to me. But like I never hear a story about technology from Europe that doesn't involve like the whole thing is about how we're going to regulate this. And basically it's end up like, we would rather not have any of this rather than like have it unregulated. Whereas in California, it's the opposite. It's kind of like, we're not going to say it out loud, guys, but we want no regulations and the government can all fuck off. Like we have that mentality, even no one really quite says that. But yeah, what is your sense of, maybe not the governments or whatever, but like the people? Are people in Europe, do you think, kind of optimistic about this, or are they more scared?
I think more scared. I don't think there's a lot of optimism, I would have to say.
And do you know why? Like, why is that?
Sure. I mean, like, I have an idea. I mean, obviously there are different cultures within societies, and different countries have different cultures.
Right.
But broadly speaking, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but this is just my own observation, Europeans are quite happy to live how they've always lived. And there's always controversy around innovation and changes in ways of living. People are happy in Italy or France or Portugal or Spain. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but like, you have your nice little vineyard and you grow your wine, enjoy your wine on your front porch. And we love cooking and we love working with these wonderful, beautiful ingredients. And like, that's life, right? Technology, innovation, even individual ambition, I would say in a lot of cases doesn't necessarily come into the view of what makes life good. And I think
I can resonate with that. I think that's beautiful and lovely. And I don't want to criticize that at all. I think that is very lovely. Something that I don't feel, something I don't necessarily have. But do people in, let's say, if you put yourself more easily than I can probably in the shoes of someone living in a village in Italy who's like been doing a trade for a long time, do they still enjoy technology? Are they like, I'm not too excited about this new iPhone, but sure, I'll get it because everybody has one or whatever? Or how does that work? Because there is a technology adoption in Europe. I mean, obviously.
Sure. And I mean, I obviously can't speak for everyone, or anyone. I now shall speak for the whole European continent. No.
Well, okay, Dublin is a little bit of a tech hub, right? I've definitely heard that, like Apple and Google, I think, have offices there. So yeah.
No, for sure. And obviously it's different, even within countries, within communities. And, there are people who lean much more towards wanting to adopt tech in their lives. I think the general view, though, I would say, is that people do get excited about the gadgets, the new iPhones or whatever, but then it quickly becomes something that's essential for your life, and you don't think of it necessarily as a benefit. And maybe you think about it in terms of a drawback. How do I get out of spending so much time on my phone? How do I, stop the algorithms from melting my brain and I can't sleep because I have to watch the next video on TikTok? So I think things that are benefits, or people get excited about the shiny new object syndrome, there's definitely joy and fleeting pleasure, I would say, in that with the new iPhone or the new gadget or whatever it is. And then I think quickly it becomes something that maybe presents obstacles in one's life, or is an adjunct to one's work, or now you're always accessible via email, and some people don't like that. So I think that the problems for individuals present fairly quickly, and we forget because we don't have a culture that reinforces the idea that this is a huge benefit. But you also, yes, of course, have to be discerning and have to make decisions about your own life and how you use technology in your own life. And I think that's the aspect which is maybe missing from the conversations that we have. But in terms of how we get people excited, I think it moves the way it always has. There'll be parts of the culture that will not be excited by something like living on Mars, but there'll be more and more people, maybe over time, when they see that the first colonists on Mars are successful, who will want to follow in those footsteps. There'll always be adventurers. There'll always be people who want to push boundaries. But the more interesting question is the one you've asked, which is there are parts of society, people, individuals, and you can't negate that experience. There's nothing to say that that's a less valuable experience, right? That you just enjoy other things in your life other than new gadgets and new technologies or new ways of living.
Yeah, to bring it back to Zoltan again, it was so fascinating to read about his early life and how almost straight out of the womb, it seems like he was an adventurer. I think that there was a note about how when he was 16, he ran away from home and went to Bolivia or something like this and lived on the beach and took drugs. And I mean, yes, that gives me hope for humanity because I have a teeny bit of that bug, but I just admire people so much who are just the people who would have been on the frontier of America, pushing out to the coast or whatever, that sort of mentality. Because looking back, those people gave us so much. Those people kind of gave us everything. Humanity conquered the world at some level, for better or worse, right? But we did. And even if you want to say we're a stain on the world or something like this, it's damn impressive. It's impressive what we've done and what we've built. And the skyscrapers we can now build super easily. Skyscrapers are ancient, boring technology now. It's very, very, very impressive. And I will say, it is inspiring reading about Zoltan's life because I've talked to him, I've read a bunch of his articles, and he will drop anecdotes about, I sailed around the world and, that sort of a thing. But this is what I really appreciate about your biography, and, why I would be excited for people to buy it, is that, it takes you there. And it's a different experience to kind of, at least for a paragraph or two, be with Zoltan on the boat as the waves are crashing down and he's thinking about how he might die. And you're thinking about how he was just in his journal writing very adolescent poetry sort of thing. And so you're kind of there with him and you kind of get that sense. And it is a Wild West thing. And to feel the Wild West is still here with us and there still is a frontier and it's out there. And people like Zoltan are trying to find that new frontier. It's exciting and it's very compelling. So yeah, that's one of my big takeaways from the book, is that I think that it books are still just very important as a technology. Speaking of technology, books are so important. This is my sloppy pivot because I want to talk to you a little bit about literature.
Well, I appreciate you saying all that. And yes, hopefully people will pre-order and buy the book. That would be awesome.
Oh, absolutely. No, I definitely think that people should. I want to, so this is me again, just my Americanism or whatever, but I have always been fascinated by the literary roots of Ireland. Can you talk to me a little bit about why people from Ireland are such good writers, consistently throughout history, and they continue to be, and they seem to have a very, literature seems to be very integrated into their culture in a way that it is not really in America, I think. Can you speak to me a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, it's something that was drummed into us, I guess, in school and all through college, the Irish writer, and Ireland certainly places a lot of value on its culture and its literary history. I think, why has it been that way? Obviously, there are different theories, different views, but I guess we have a unique history. We were a colonized country, so obviously Britain occupied Ireland for centuries, and a lot of native Irish people were put away from their homes, and there was a unique experience, not a unique experience, but there was an experience of colonization, of misery, of centuries of pain. And that obviously comes through in some of the best Irish writing. You know, I wouldn't say that Ireland is unique in terms of its literary heritage and literary history, but maybe within the English language, Ireland has a unique place because of that historical.
It punches way above its weight. You know what I mean? Like, it's crazy how much it punches above its weight. It's nuts. It's like San Francisco in America, I feel like, in terms of technology. San Francisco is a tiny city, and it punches so far above its weight. And I feel like Ireland is like that for literature. And I mean, you know, part of my question here is, do people in Ireland, do they mythologize literary figures? I always think that, like, if people are kind of mythologized, that's the big deal, like, because we all want to be close to a mythology and participate in a mythology. Do you think that that's a thing? Has that happened with writers there? Are they seen as almost like bigger than life?
They are and they aren't. I mean, when I've said that Ireland celebrates its culture and so on, there's an extent you could make an argument. Many people have, many artists, contemporary writers would make the argument that we don't invest in the right ways at a government level in terms of supporting our arts and culture. Our Irish literary figures, though, are certainly celebrated. Ireland in general, Irish people in general, I would say, are skeptical, suspicious of hero worship.
So, interesting. Okay, interesting.
So we don't necessarily, and this is an aspect that maybe is why aspects of our culture are not future oriented as well, or individual oriented, but we would be, you know, we would think that somebody was above his station or above himself if he was,
interesting.
Yes. So there is that aspect of the culture. So I'd say people are celebrated as products of their community or exemplars of what that community has to say about itself. Maybe that's the way to think about writers. Seamus Heaney would have been thought of that way for sure. A lot of our poets. And so people, it's almost like a sporting affiliation, I guess any type of patriotism. People feel a certain amount of possession, a certain ownership over the success of our writers. And so it's not that they're mythologized in so much as we laud them as saints, but that they're products of our culture that exemplify the best of us.
Interesting. Okay, that's good. I one more question along these lines, just so I'm curious. What is the opinion of J.P. Dunleavy over in Ireland? I know he was an American author, but he moved to Ireland, spent almost all of his life in a mansion, I believe, outside of Dublin. Is there, and the Ginger Man obviously takes place at the Trinity College where you went. Is there an affinity towards him, or do people not like him? Or I'm just kind of curious.
Oh no, there's a definite affinity. There's a pub right across the road from Trinity, the Ginger Man.
Really? Oh, funny. Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. So there's definitely an affinity. There's always a case, there's a little bit of begrudgery. Irish attitudes toward people who are successful Irish people are always complex. Especially a lot of our writers have gone abroad and maybe been more welcomed abroad than they were in Ireland because they wrote about things that were taboo or. And Oscar Wilde obviously made a name for himself in London. Samuel Beckett did his best work in France. So we still take ownership of them, maybe belatedly. But so we definitely celebrate, but maybe at the time there's mixed attitudes. But they tend to get their due in due course.
So one more question about Zoltan, just to wrap it up. Speaking of him as a literary figure, but also as maybe a larger than life figure in a lot of things, what do you think that his legacy is going to be? He's obviously still a young man, has a lot ahead of him, but it did make sense to write his biography right now. Having read it, like it makes sense that this is coming out because it just encapsulates so much, and it is like a whole. It feels like a whole. But yeah, what do you think his legacy is going to be? Do you have any sense of that?
It's interesting. One of the questions that another Irish writer, Mark O'Connell, raises towards the end of his book on transhumanism, To Be a Machine.
Oh, I've read that. That's a good book. I have it on my bookshelf. Yeah. Yellow cover. It's good. Yeah.
yeah. That was a fun book. But one of the questions he raises towards the end, which I always thought was fascinating, and I know Zoltan thinks is fascinating too, is will the transhumanists be forgotten because the future that they're bringing about will just happen with or without them. You know, it kind of goes back to that question we were asking at the start. Would Silicon Valley have happened without certain things, certain authors, certain advocates? And because technology is embedded across our culture, even if it's not viewed positively, things like AI happen anyway. The tech kind of pushes forward in whatever ways it can, however the regulation works. Capital's like water, right? The technology will happen somewhere, the money will flow to somewhere. And so the culture will advance. And whether transhumanism or folks like Zoltan get the credit for things that they helped bring about, I think is an interesting and an open question. And whether transhumanism as a philosophy that advocates for radical technology, whether it'll even be remembered as such 50 years from now as being part of a person living forever. And so I think Zoltan is kind of a very, very interesting figure in that phenomenon. He's kind of the exemplar of will transhumanism be remembered, because he is a prophet of it. He is a primary advocate, I would say. And so his legacy, I think he still thinks, you probably saw this in the book, he still thinks there's a chance he might win a Nobel Prize or get major recognition as the philosopher, as the advocate, as the prophet of transhumanism, not as the guy who invents the technology, but as the guy who helps shape the cultural environment in which it happens. Mm-hmm. And I still think that's an open question. I still think we don't know where we're going to be in 30 years, and hopefully we'll have made life multi-planetary, in Musk's phrase. Hopefully the first person to live forever has already been born. And I think Zoltan should be remembered as a prophet, and maybe a prophet who was before his time, but I think his work will be studied decades and maybe hundreds of years from now, because there are few enough people advocating for the things he's advocating for. And I do think those things will ultimately be possible, that even at that point, historians will look back and they'll think, oh, you know, how did this happen? How did this come about? Who were maybe the underrated figures? And I think Zoltan can look forward, hopefully, to a very, very well-acknowledged legacy. And hopefully, of course, he'll be around to see all those historians write about him, because he does hope to live that long and live forever, indeed. So.
And what are you working on next, Ben? Do you have any other books in the works?
Yeah, sure. So in my day job, you know, I work for a company called International Living. So you can see some of my work there, International Living magazine. And I manage a publication called the Global Intelligence Letter. You can check that out at globalintelligenceletter.com. That's kind of a unique perspective on the global economy.
Cool.
In which we also cover things like AI and impending debt crises and things like that. So folks can check that out. I am working on more projects. Obviously, there's going to be hopefully some publicity and some exciting projects that come out of the Zoltan book, Transhuman Citizen. I still want to write, which is what I'm working on now, the sequel to my very first book, which was called 2 in a Million, which was about growing up with this very rare illness called Fanconi anemia, and I guess how you survive as a person who spends a lot of time in hospital and, you know, maybe has a different kind of life to his peers. So I'm very well now. I had a bone marrow transplant, and most of that stuff is no longer a major part of my life. But I'm interested in writing a sequel that would focus on the psychological long tail of those childhood experiences, if you like, and also the fact that my wife also has this illness, and we met at a conference, and so it's that idea of, you know, two people who meet and who have a lot in common in maybe unusual ways, and you end up with a person who has the same illness as you, which is kind of strange, but it's almost, it becomes a partnership because you don't have to address the big elephant in the room all the time, because you both understand where you're coming from, right? So I'm interested in that idea of two people with the same illness meeting across an ocean. So I have lots of projects that I still hope to do.
Great. But yeah, I will check those out. That's exciting. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on today, Ben. That was a lot of fun, and I will drop the link in the show notes below to anyone looking out for the biography of Zoltan Istvan. And yeah, thanks again, Ben. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Peter. Real pleasure. Thank you again.